Hello, everybody, and welcome back for the final formal panel of the conference today. Today, we've heard about insights that might improve SciComm practice and training related to basic science. And this session is going to take us full circle for SciPEP, since it's where we started 3 years ago, reviewing the research literature in the hope that there had been some research effort spent on science communication in the context of basic science. Finding almost none, part of our effort since then has been fleshing out what questions we wish had been asked or what could be asked now to help further our understanding of how scientists can productively engage various publics in the context of basic science. Now, this research clearly will tap the expertise of many of the social scientists currently at work in SciComm. As I noted yesterday, one of the real joys of the past 3 years has been watching a number of research projects beginning to ask questions that will illuminate the communication of discovery science, as well as all the other SciComm issues that we're already paying attention to. We've asked a couple of our colleagues from the SciComm research world to join to tell us about their thoughts for developing a research agenda that could make headway on our understanding of basic science communication. Sara from the University of Utah and VanDyke from the University of Alabama. Joining me to add their thoughts and join us in the discussion are Nick Bennett from the University of Texas, Austin, and Jayatri of the Franklin Institute. We'll be tossing some questions around between the 5 of us for a bit after the solo presentations, then take audience questions from the chat queue. Remember, we won't be taking questions between the presentations, but we'll save them for the general discussion as we have been for the other sessions. Put your questions for the panelists in the Q&A chat with general observations, thoughts, or musings in the general open chat for everyone else. I'm going to ask all of my colleagues to join me on the screen for just a little bit to introduce themselves a little more fully. So if I could have everybody on stage again. And we can start with Sara, who can reintroduce yourself after being seen almost every session so far, which is appropriate. Sara.
Just one other session. Thank you, Rick. It's wonderful to be here. Again, I'm Sara Yo. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Utah, and broadly, I study science communication.
Thank you very much. Matt?
Hey, everyone. It's great to be here with you. My name is Matt VanDyke. I'm also an associate professor. I'm in the Department of Advertising and Public Relations at the University of Alabama. And I'm also recently appointed faculty lead of the Alabama Science Communication Initiative to study science communication primarily from a public relations perspective.
Nick.
Thanks for having me. Hi, I'm Nick Bennett. Very close to being done with a PhD candidate. Thank you. And I'm at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm also a researcher, and I think about power, ideology, and belonging in science communication. Thanks so much for having us.
And Jayatri.
It is great to be here. I am Jayatri Das, Chief Bioscientist and Director of Science Content at the Franklin Institute Science Museum in Philadelphia. And I'm very much in the research to practice world. I collaborate with many scientists in actually thinking about how we translate basic science or discovery science for public engagement. And we also do science communication training for mostly early career scientists here at the museum. So it's really been great to hear all of these ideas and thinking about what that means for the work that we do.
It's terrific having you all here. And I think most of us can now go off camera while we turn the camera over to Sara.
Thank you. Let me go ahead and share the presentation that I have. Of course, when we were talking about this over email, Rick said you have 1 slide, so I made 2. So that's what I'm going to do. And so we're talking today about a science communication research agenda and thinking about what we might include in a research agenda. And so very quickly, I came up with kind of this table where we have different cells, right? There's in the columns, the kind of descriptive things that we need to know. And in the next column, sort of the injunctive things. What can we envision or what could be, right? Or ought to be. We can use either of these. And then in the rows, we have things, 3 things. We have perceptions. We have research questions maybe around strategic goals and motivations, and then also questions around training. And so looking first at that first row in public perceptions, we can think about sort of the descriptive research questions that we might have might include something around how do publics perceive basic science and scientists, and perhaps what values help form those perceptions. In the cell where we're thinking about what could or should be, we might think about how we would like publics to perceive basic science and scientists. And before we ask about slides, these slides are going to be available after the session in the Knowledge Hub. And so you can go there to look for them. In the strategic goals and motivations, descriptive questions around what goals and objectives, right, might motivate communication around basic science. What tactics are used? In the sort of would or ought to be, what kinds of goals, objectives, and tactics are effective for communicating basic science? In training, do we have a landscape view of what trainings currently exist, and maybe perhaps what trainings are specific to basic science? And then sort of what trainings can or should exist if we decide that basic and applied sciences along this continuum are different, right? And then I'll leave you really quickly so Matt also has time to share his thoughts with this particular, what I like to think of as perhaps an organizing tool for thinking about goals, objectives, and the tactics used. You don't see tactics anywhere on here, but we might think of this as a core, sort of having a core competency of communication, right? The very communication 101 that might be relevant to basic applied sciences, communicating all kinds of science. But then we have different objectives, right? And those objectives might be related to the levels of practice that Ayelet and Bruce have come up with and conceptualized, the occasional communicators, the active ones, and then the professional ones. We can imagine that for any specific communication goal, which is a slice of the pie, their goals might be different. Their objectives might be different for that goal, right? Depending on their level of practice. And so again, slides will be available on the Knowledge Hub after the session, and I'll just leave it there for now. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Sara. Matt, how about queuing you up? I hope you're going to make the apology for the number of slides, since we know you have more than 2.
Yes, but the way that I started out, 1 slide, 3 bullet points, and I thought they needed slightly more context. So I'll be very quick. If I can share screen. Okay, can everyone see?
Looks good.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you all again for the opportunity to participate today. I primarily study science communication, as I said, from a strategic communication standpoint, like a lot of the colleagues that you've heard today and yesterday. And when I was thinking about what a research agenda for SciComm could include, obviously my perspective really influenced how what informed my thoughts about what we should include in such an agenda. And this kind of dovetails with the end of the last session. And so 3 broad buckets that I thought about, starting from the micro level and then going to a broader, almost kind of system level, but not quite that far. The first is thinking about communication strategies. And to back up just a second, one of the things that I also want to encourage us to think about are the other buckets of communication evidence that already exist that we could pull from to help us frame our questions and or to draw insights from the bodies of knowledge that already exist in those spaces. So one of the things that we've talked a lot about are, depending on what your goals are, there are different strategies, tactics you might take to get there. And so one area for future research that we obviously need to really focus on are what communication strategies and tactics work for who should be doing that type of work. And one sample question that we often throw around, I know it came up even yesterday, is how do we inspire people? How can we use our communication to perhaps give people a sense of wonder or awe, or inspire information seeking, for example? Well, those types of questions have actually been studied in parallel sister disciplines, I'll say. One example is positive media psychology, at least for the past decade, has been looking at how do media inspire or give feelings of elevation, a sense of elevation. So not just looking at media as something that's entertaining or something that we consume for purely hedonic purposes, but when we encounter media for virtue or for beauty or awe or wonder, this is the type these are the types of questions that this body of literature is actually looking at, including how to design messages that actually evoke a sense of inspiration and curiosity. I won't say curiosity, I know inspiration for sure, but you can see how those types of questions would be transferable into a basic science context. Now, if we zoom out and thinking about not just the work itself, but the people who do the work, we've talked a lot about basic scientists and science communication, science communicators broadly, but also science communication trainers. But I think it's useful to perhaps look at all of the professions and/or professionals who should be in the science communication ecosystem, and for our context, basic science. And so a lot of the basic scientists who we're talking about might not have the expertise, or as Besley mentioned yesterday, the self-efficacy or the confidence to do science communication. A lot of times they might be taking time away from the work that they actually get paid to do or are incentivized to do or resourced to do. And so what other professionals or professions exist that could actually help support and or do this type of work? And one example, and I know this is me being taking the low-hanging fruit because I'm a PR person, but the public relations literature talks extensively about increasing competence in communication strategy, the importance of evaluation and how to do it. And so for those basic scientists who might not feel comfortable with strategy, might not be as interested in strategy, might not have expertise in evaluation, what is the role of a communication professional? And that could look like a public information officer, public affairs officer, an extension person. What types of collaboration are helpful? What types of expertise are useful? I think looking at different ways to increase our communication acumen could be beneficial. And then to kind of dovetail off the last session, I was really excited that this was starting to be talked about. When we zoom out to the organizations and institutions who actually support and or should support the work that we're doing. And so I think it's really important to look at the organizations and institutions, industries, et cetera, that we're involved in and ask, do they value this work? And if not, how are they defining impact? Does that accommodate a view of communication? And if not, how do we advocate for a redefinition or an expansion of that definition to include communication engagement as part of that impact? And looking at that, how do organizations, institutions organize to do the science communication work? Is the communication function centralized, decentralized? How do organizations use communication to facilitate collaboration around basic science, for example? And depending on how it's organized in an organization, what are the implications for public engagement? And again, another pocket of literature that we could look to, and there's some movement in, there's the traditional literature, organizational communication, but there's a lot of really fascinating work now for folks who are looking at institutional communication as well. And so a lot more that we could talk about. I'm looking forward to answering any questions or expanding on these points in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks a million, Matt. I'm going to invite Nick and Sara and Jayatri to come back on the screen. And I'm going to ask Nick if they have saw anything interesting in that presentation, or there were other issues that got raised in this context that you'd like to talk about.
Oh, I saw so many interesting things. Thank you, Sara and Matt. I really appreciate, Sara, you giving us like a framework. There's like this, it feels like there's this giant landscape out here, and you started to provide a map to say, look, there's all this area maybe we haven't explored. We've explored a little, but there's more out here. And Matt, you're kind of continuing that and thinking about like, what are the interdisciplinary ways we can think about that? As an interdisciplinary person, I'm always for it. And I think my first question is kind of zooming out, big picture on these things, thinking about, especially about these oughts, thinking about who gets to decide what these oughts are. So I often think about when we do things the way they've always been done, we're often complicit in reproducing systems of oppression. And so when we think about these oughts, these values, these things like this, how can we be designing these things in ways that are actively resisting these things? And so it's kind of out there and abstract. So I often think about an example of even just what we count as science communication. So does culture count? And if culture doesn't count, then some of like Monica's advice yesterday of culturally relevant communication ends up kind of not making as much sense. So I think that's a very broad question, but like the who gets to decide the oughts and how can we be intentional as a community about that?
Excellent questions. Before we take any answers, thoughts that Sara and Matt might have about this, and then maybe some folks from the audience too, maybe we could turn our attention to Jayatri, who looks like she might have dropped off. So we'll wait for Jayatri to come back for the next batch and ask the text to help get her back for us. In the meantime, Matt, Sara, you have reactions to Nick's comments or thoughts there? Who is the oughts? Who decides the oughts?
Yeah, I can poke at this question, I suppose. Who decides the oughts? I think to some extent, we're talking about a research agenda, right? There are some empirical answers, perhaps, to the oughts. I think perhaps it is up to us here in this community to collectively consider and reflect on what, and maybe oughts it's not the perfect word for it, right? What the coulds or the should, maybe should is not, the could be's, right? What sorts of, trainings, objectives, goals, tactics, strategies broadly can we take? So a lot of those questions, I feel, as a researcher, are empirical questions. But of course, as a researcher, right, I have a hammer, so everything is a nail. I understand that research takes a lot of time, right? It's resource intensive, doesn't always fit with kind of the timelines and the goals goals of practitioners, right? And so I think being reflexive and mindful and flexible about those.
And just
Matt, I'll have another sort of specific question after you talk about that to narrow it down a little bit more. Go ahead, Matt.
Just adding to what Sara already said, because I agree. I think those of us who are in these spaces and have the ability to advocate for the oughts, like we're doing, but also similar to what I mentioned about institutions and so forth. I think we have. I don't want to say responsibility or duty. I feel at least that that's part of my charges, because I'm a tenured professor at a public university who studies this stuff. I feel some sense of obligation and responsibility to advocate and try to make the system better and more inclusive and so forth. And so I think that's part of it as well. I don't know. To Sara's point, to poke at it, that's kind of what came to mind for me.
In the three of your minds, who currently drives the research agenda for science communication? How does that research agenda get set now?
So that's a really great question. I think it's sort of, okay, here's the social science answer, right? It depends. Depends on who you are. It depends on who that researcher is. It depends on the priorities of that researcher. I will say in my own research, I've been, I'll give you a step back a little bit. I focus a lot on humor and using humor as a strategy for communication. One thing that Anthony had mentioned in the previous session is that there's sort of this idea of researching the tactics, right? Empirical questions around the tactics specifically. And so that's a lot of the work that I do, that I've chosen to do, right? I think science communication as a field, we're very fortunate to have a community of practice that we can collaborate with, right? And taking advantage of that community of practice to ask research questions that are practical and undergirded by theory are really critical. But I will stop here because I see that Jayatri has just come back.
Sorry about that. I lost my internet connection altogether. had to scramble. So I'm happy to be back.
Welcome back. We were just talking a little bit about who sets the research agenda, and that was sparked by Nick's comment about, who decides what the oughts in the matrix that Sara had created. Who are the oughts who decide what ought to happen? And if you had a reaction to that, we were just sort of going through that now.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great question, because one of the things that came to my mind as I've been listening to a lot of the discussion is that, we often think about what questions that we want to ask around scientists and their involvement, as well as public perceptions of scientists. But I would love, as somebody who works with, public participants, I'm always interested in, how do we research and evaluate the impact of participating in, in basic science and receiving communication or participating in engagement? What's the impact of that on the public audiences themselves? And how do we get their voice into our research agenda as well? I think somebody raised a good question in one of the earlier sessions. It's like, how do we know that we're being effective? And there are lots of different places at which we can, assess what that effectiveness means. But at the end of the day, I want to make sure that we're really thinking about, public audiences and what they care about, and how our involvement in this space really supports a bigger story of what does it mean to be part of science.
Matt, you have a chance to weigh in here now on the question of who's going to be deciding the oughts.
I think Sara actually put the report in the chat, but bodies like NASM and collective partnerships like the SciPEP and other folks who have a megaphone really do, I think, drive a lot of what at least the field does in terms of individual researchers and so forth. It is, I think Keegan also mentioned the institutions who fund the work. That's getting better, but it's still not at the extent that I would say communication researchers who identify as communication researchers would probably prefer. There are foundations, there are thinking about us beyond the broader impact that's tacked on to a larger STEM project is what I would hope, this is me advocating, I would hope that there are more programs that exist to help us do the basic science of science communication, more so than just occasional calls for proposals and things like that. So I've as we all know, it's getting better in the past. I think someone in a previous session mentioned definitely in the past decade, there's been a lot more activity, and hopefully that just continues to ramp up.
While you have the screen there, Matt, we spend a lot of money in other fields, in advertising and PR and marketing on this relative to what we spend in science. How do we get some parity? I mean, what does it take to get to parity? Does it require us contributing to somebody's bottom line? Is that what the issue is?
That's a fabulous question that we could teach a class on. I in my mind, I think you mentioned advertising, public relations, marketing. I think that specific slice of communication is tough anyway, just because perhaps, I don't know, but I could see basic scientists or others saying, ooh, PR, advertising, marketing, those are dirty words, aren't they? Even though we do theory-based research that's guided by codes of ethics and PR, advertising, they all have PR problems. There's a lot of research to identify that. And if I said PR and advertising, you probably have your own reactions to those terms. And so I think having an honest conversation about the aughts in those veins too, there are bodies of literature that exist that are very well developed in terms of understanding how people make decisions. And again, a lot of times that's for persuasive purposes to buy products and services, but also for pro-social good, to adopt healthy behaviors, to recycle, those types of things. And so the literature exists. And again, I know not everyone has those types of goals, but I think part of it is we have to be willing to collaborate with folks who speak a different language and may have had different goals than we do. Maybe we use the secondary research and figure out avenues that we can complement each other to answer some of these more basic science pressing questions. I don't know if that's poking around enough.
Other thoughts there? If not, I'm going to pull a question out of the chat that I think is plays to.
I had a quick thought I'd love to add. Jayatri, go ahead. Mine's going to add on to yours anyway.
Well, I was going to share a quick story about a project that I've been involved with. I'll give a shout out to folks at the Kavli Foundation and as well as the Dana Foundation in thinking about how do we elevate the importance and the value of public engagement and science communication to a disciplinary or a field-wide level. And I've been involved with some efforts around this in neuroscience, where it's not reliant on an individual institution or an individual scientist to determine the value of science communication, but really starting to articulate why is communication and engagement important for science and how does that lead to higher quality and higher impact science. And that elevates then the efforts to do so that, hopefully, as these foundations are trying to model that, it justifies allocating funding towards these efforts along with the research agenda.
Yeah, just quickly adding on to Jayatri's earlier point about the audiences. We do so often see the research agenda being placed by researchers, by institutions, but it does make me wonder about what would a co-created, like community partnered or community-led venture look like. We always say we value these things, but some recent research shows that it's mostly words at this point, but what kind of structures would we need to see more of that?
Shannon specifically asks in the chat, how can we make our science communication research more based in community-based participatory research with the audiences for science communication that we've already discussed, especially the ones that don't get reached as often?
So I think we can wrap that in with Derek's question about sort of inputs from people at science centers, right? So questions about, and Nick's comment about co-created projects, for example. So I'll give one example of a National Science Foundation NSF-funded program that encourages these kinds of things, right? The Advancing Informal STEM Learning Program, ASIL, requires a practitioner or practitioners as well as researchers collaborating on a project. And so these kinds of structures, I think, can encourage research in this vein. Right? That may be community-based participatory research, which is a very specific type and flavor of research, right? Or it can, also be maybe not community-based CBPR, but involve practitioners as well as researchers collaborating and co-creating. And I believe they have planning grants that allow, right, time and space and resources to plan those types of projects as well. So it's just one example, right? I don't actually know of other ones necessarily. I'm sure they exist, but I think more of these kinds of mechanisms, right, that encourage these collaborations and co-creation of projects would be very helpful to a research agenda in science communication and engagement broadly writ, not just for basic science or basic scientists.
Is the broader impacts ecosystem at NSF not doing that? Those of you who know that system, I think that's one of the things it was set up to do, is to create an ecosystem of both learners, practitioners, and scholars who would be able to do a better job of broader impacts communication. Is that working? I will say I haven't seen it. I'll be clear. I haven't seen it.
There's concept and then there's operationalization in my opinion. And I mean, everybody has their own experience, but it's better than it used to be on the projects that I'm a part of. And part of it is I try to do projects with people who want to co-create design and don't think of communication and impact as that thing that we do because we have to get the funds. But I think to Sarah's point, I think the time and the space and the resources, regardless of the programs that currently exist and the intentions of them, I think a lot of people in positions are doing the work because they believe in it. And I think it's, I hear that organizations are very good at relying on passion tax. And so I when we don't think of this work as something that we just do because everybody does it, or of course we do it. It should be ingrained in our DNA perhaps, but when you're evaluated every year for merit raises, or when you when it comes time for tenure and promotion, or whatever it is that you benchmarks and metrics that you have to meet to keep a job, if this stuff is not integrated into that value system, then it's going to be a hard thing, I think, to sustain long term, and also to not burn people out with, because like we've talked about, doing authentic community engaged research, getting communities to trust you and to get access, and also not saying it but doing it, being part of the community and actually giving back to them. That's more than a publication, right? And so that takes a lot of work, and not all of that work perhaps is explicitly acknowledged or valued by institutions, and perhaps that needs to change.
Additional thoughts for that? I will note that one of the very challenging pieces, I think, is that I believe what we've been describing here is a very stovepiped research landscape, where, and Derek mentions this in the chat also, that the ASTC conference is coming up. It historically does not have many science communications practitioners there. Many of the journalism conferences actively ask, or just, I wouldn't say discriminate against, but actively discourage meaningful roles for people who are doing, practice, like public affairs officers. How do we manage to bring those organizations, those meetings, those opportunities? AJMC coming up in just a couple of weeks. How do we get those institutions to all collaborate around this larger research agenda? Who goes out to all the stakeholders and says, folks, we need a research agenda. How can we create that research agenda, and what role do you want to play in that? brilliant ideas?
So I always like to talk about Portal to the Public as an example of, how this, this kind of effort could potentially be organized and scaled up. We were just one of the many museum partners who were part of the Portal to the Public network. And I think that was really one of the groundbreaking intersections between the science communication training and science museum worlds. I'm blanking. Maybe somebody in the audience can remember a paper that somebody did a network analysis of the informal science education field, the science communication field, and they're basically there's no overlap. And so the problem that Rick outlines is real, but I think if we find these systems that that maybe we can scale up and start to bring these networks together, we have some models of what works. But to address Derek's point in one other angle, is that I think science museums would also be honest in saying that we can contribute to supporting certain goals of SciComm, but not all. And we would be honest about the limitations that we have in terms of and strengths on both regards of how we can intersect with the challenges that we're discussing. And so I think we do need sort of this broader landscape analysis to think about how, like, where do these different worlds come together? Which ones are best suited to to maybe pursuing it in separate directions, and where do we come together?
Other thoughts on that? It's an important point, I think. I mean, Bruce noted earlier, there's this 40-year history or more of science communication research under that name, more or less. And it seems to me, and this is just anecdotally as I watch it, that it's become more and more and more fractured, just as publishing has become, focused on least publishable units. It seems like we're really, really finely drawing the lines of what research we do in what fields and to what end. And no one ever talks. The journals don't talk to each other. The practitioners don't talk to each other. The scholars don't talk to each other. How do we make sure those conversations happen? What's the space we need for that?
This was making me think of a question that I also had in terms of some of Matthew's proposal as well, of like the norms that have led to this siloing. Like the reason we keep calling for interdisciplinarity, the reason we keep calling for research practice, is that often the norms of these different systems are rewarding us for staying siloed. Anecdotally, it seems like there's a lot of individualism of like, I am much more rewarded if I start my own thing than if I support someone else who already has something amazing going on. And so there's some cultural aspects, there's some norms aspects that we might want to zoom out and look at.
Erica points out that one of the issues that she thinks may be contributing to this is that funders often want to develop their own brand new ideas, as opposed to focusing on expanding, extending, advancing the research. And I see that a lot, and did a review of some of the science communication literature over a 20-year period, and saw that there was a new emerging technology, a lot of money dumped into it, and another emerging technology, a lot of money dumped into it, doing the same things for each emerging technology, but not advancing the field in any of them. Is that resonant with your experience? Are we repeating ourselves with different technologies or different issues, but not really advancing the field? Except for humor, of course, Sara.
Of course. Well, I mean, I do think there is advancing in the field. I'm going to yes and all these things, right? Things that Erica has mentioned in the chat about funders, a message that Jacqueline just sent, right? Sorry, Jacqueline, you mentioned funding. But I think, we have been talking a long time about more connections being needed in this ecosystem of practice, research, training. Then there's different domains of science communication, right? From the communication discipline and informal science education from the education discipline. But I think So all of these things are the case, right? Everyone has different pressures and everyone has different kind of pulls on them. And so as a researcher in an academic setting like Matt and I are, we have different sort of requirements, right? For career advancement, for example, that may not align with some of these things, some of these ideals that we think ought to be the case, right? And while, yes, certainly I think we could have a bottom-up approach to co-creating these kinds of projects and doing the research, there's not a lot of incentive to do so, right? And I wonder then about kind of the incentive and the structure and the support infrastructure to do that. And I think those things are key to encouraging the types of collaboration that we are discussing and, thinking about where that might come from, right? We talked about who sets the research agenda. Well, initiatives like SciPEP sort of set this research agenda. We are all brought together to talk about these, and this is making connections, right? But we're connecting around basic science, and maybe, Rick, this gets to the idea of are we repeating this and reinventing the wheel every time we talk about a different issue, like basic science or artificial intelligence or climate or so on? And I'm sure there's a fair amount of all these things, right? Yes, we reinvent the wheel again, but we also advance it. I mean, it's quite similarly to how hopefully science advances. We are hopefully doing a similar thing here in pushing the envelope just a little bit forward. I'm feeling very optimistic today for some reason.
I was going to say, this is so not you.
Very weird.
So not you.
I'll take it. I like the balance.
So let's assume we've solved the big research project now, and we've come to these wonderful research conclusions, and we've solved the issues of the world. How do you get practitioners to pay attention? And I'll tell you that this is another big challenge that we face. I used to teach a course for CASE for university science communicators about how to do a better job of university science communication. The first thing I would do is give them each 3 blank index cards, and I would ask them to write on there the name of 2 peer-reviewed journals in science communication, 2 researchers in science communication, and 1 paper that they'd read recently in science communication. And 90% of those cards came back to me blank, because there is a great disconnect between the people who are doing this work and the people who are doing the research on this work. We don't really, that's another place where we don't have a common space. What's a common space that we can explore for that, to be able to get practitioners and researchers to talk together in ways that make sense for the practitioners to incorporate?
I'll say, at least from again, borrowing from public relations, the professional associations tend to be the ones that do a lot of the professional development, and that obviously there's commentary in terms of which associations provide more value and what they focus on and this, that, and the other thing. But I think perhaps professional associations or collectives like this, like Sara mentioned, are places where we can get momentum. I think obviously public relations is focused on the core competencies and skills of PR. And so in order for there to be, if we want to focus specifically on basic science communication, I imagine a specific division of an association or a more formal collective of folks focused on that specific domain are necessary. But that's my thought.
The thoughts, where could this live? Where would this nexus be?
I'll add one. I would agree, Matt, with your assessment that professional organizations can set the tone, certainly for collaboration, and hopefully, maybe support platforms for sharing. Certainly in the museum world, one barrier is just access to journals, access to the literature. I'm lucky to have a university affiliation, and so I have access to literature, but I am the minority. And so I think there needs to not just be like, how do they find out what we're doing, but where do we communicate this so that it's accessible to everybody? And, I felt like we were starting to have a few years where Twitter was a great space to bring people together, but, that's kind of exploding. So what's next?
Is the language of social science communication accessible to non-social scientists? Who's the boundary spanner there? Is that us?
I will say I'm gonna punt on that question, Rick. But to the point that Jayatri made about access to publications, for example, let's not get to deciphering the publications yet. Let's just talk about access, right? I just really dislike that this is a barrier. And so I will say this now in front of the 130 people watching, that if there are papers that you would like that I have been an author on, I'm happy to send them to you if you will just email me, because that should not be a barrier. And this is also why one of my research areas is getting into the open science space, right? This idea that science should be accessible. And this is broader than just communication, but this is the context in which this really bothers me, right? Is that you can't, my research has to be theoretical because I have to publish it in X, Y, and Z journal, and that's what they're taking. But I want it to be practical too. I want it to help inform something that someone is doing out there. Otherwise, there's no point to me doing my research, right? Otherwise, what am I doing it for? Just to publish it in a journal that nobody's going to read? I think about this all the time because when I sent my dad my dissertation, he said it was too dry. He didn't read it. It's too long. And I don't want that to happen to research that I do that hopefully will help communicate science, right? Because I think in my very optimistic, idealistic mood that I am in today, my research is for helping us make a better connection between science and society. And so I would hope that it is used in that way.
So one really interesting question in the chat is going to put every one of you on the spot. If you could pick one major research question that you would like to see this new research agenda address, what would it be? And I'll start with Nick.
Can you repeat the question for me?
What is one research question that you would like this new research agenda to address that's not currently being addressed or not addressed well?
I think
could be macro, could be macro.
Yeah, and I think mine is relatively macro and kind of in line with some of the questions I've asked earlier of who is included and given power with the ways that we currently do science communication, and what are the interventions we can do to change that?
Sara. Something besides humor.
Humor, Rick. Punt.
Matt.
I was trying to think of a double, triple, quadruple barreled question to get all of it in, but similarly, that's a really tough question. But I think from my perspective, how can we integrate the subdomains of communication, the knowledge bases that exist? How can we integrate that to better inform and complement some of the questions we're asking, and how do we translate that to the people who need it?
Jayatri?
One of the themes that I've heard come up again and again at not just this gathering, but in other spaces as well, is that, one of the critical things to support the future of really more inclusive science communication is a shift from deficit thinking to more of an engagement, collaboration, dialogue mindset. We know that can happen because we see it happen in individual cases or individual projects. But I would love to know sort of what are the interventions that lead to that shift in mindset, and how do we scale that up or design training strategies and things to support that shift in mindset.
Let me go back to Matt. Good. Yep. Back to Matt for a second and ask, from your perspective, how did all these research domains get separated in the first place? I mean, extension and science communication at one time were, cheek to cheek in this, and now they don't. There are no joint communication efforts between those two fields really at all.
I'm not sure about the specific, like the dichotomy between extension and communication. I'll say my understanding of why there's diversity in the communication discipline. In my opinion, it's because we similar to the questions that have been posed about the dichotomy between basic and applied science. A lot of times, communication researchers are focused on theoretical concepts, whether it's that they're focused on public opinion dynamics or message content features, so different types of message appeals like humor, how different structures work like narratives, and that's their thing that they attach to. And a lot of times, I don't know about everyone else's experience, but we're trained that way. What theory and or method or methods are you going to contribute to? What theoretical base? And whereas I'll say, at least in my program, I wanted to do science, environmental risk, and public engagement with it. And I wanted to pull from all these theories to answer those specific context questions. And I was often told, I don't know if that's a smart strategy for you. You're going to want to get tenure. And so I think, kind of going back to Nick's comment about some of the norms around even how we're trained within our discipline, could perhaps shift to be more, and again, I know it's you've got to be careful, but I think problem-focused research is one way to do it. But again, everybody's got their specific problem, and so who organizes that? And I don't know. I'm swimming in my thoughts.
Can I jump in on the extension question here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just thinking about extension and communication, I'm not sure that it is as separate as we think or we might perceive it to be, because there are many places where there are extension folks maybe not doing the science communication research. Certainly there are some of these, right? Cornell, for example, I think comes to mind, and then University of Wisconsin-Madison, right? The Life Sciences Communication Department, where I did most of my graduate work in, there are extension people embedded in there who do some of that research as well, right? So I think, and many of these kind of science communication departments, there aren't that many in the country, specifically science communication departments at universities. Many of these that we think about are born of things like agricultural journalism, which are very much extension-based programs, right? And so I think these people exist, people who do the research, science communication or engagement research in the context of extension work. So another example, Utah State University, which is the land-grant university in the state I live in, right? In watershed sciences, they have, for example, someone doing a lot of this extension work who I've been talking with about research and science communication to facilitate that work. I will also come back to the question I punted on about the research agenda.
Yes, where are they publishing, since they're not publishing in the same literature that we are?
Yeah, so I think this is interesting too. I feel a lot of, so for example, in watershed sciences, some of this work gets published in ecology journals, for example, right? Again, those discipline-specific journals, not necessarily science communication. Science communication work shows up everywhere across disciplines and across disciplinary journals, right? You can find some in physics education journals, for example. Journals that the Ecological Society of America, right, supports. You can find some science communication work in there. Journals like energy policy. It sometimes depends on the context, right? And I think this is a function of communication, science communication and engagement researchers trying to find a place to publish that work that is maybe considered less theoretical than others and may not fit in their communication discipline journals, right? Because of whatever, prevailing norms in the discipline.
And your punted question?
Oh, right. Yes. The question of like, if I had to pick one research agenda, I do not like this question that much because it's like, I don't like this one. I like diversity, right? But I think I would maybe focus on kind of the tactics, right? So I kind of jokingly said humor, but humor is one of those tactics that we think about when it comes to strategic science communication, but other types of tactics. So I'm going to leave it broad and say tactics, so I don't have to pick just one.
And Jayatri, you didn't get a chance to even punt yet. So what's your big overarching question?
I did throw out my question in terms of what interventions and strategies are effective for getting people to shift from deficit to engagement. But I'm just gonna put another shout out for the question of what is the impact of and the impact on public audiences for participating in basic research, and what does that mean?
There was a question in the chat about how much time, effort, and interest we spend in evaluative research as opposed to plowing new ground. Do you see that there's an appetite from any funders to do evaluative research like this?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's an increasing recognition that evaluation is a necessary part of your public communication and or engagement, right? So the research, I think of this, the research I do as sort of front end research, right? What might work with these audiences. And then actually, if you actually implement that, right? What the evaluation comes on kind of the back end of that. Did it actually work? Did it meet these standards that I have set for it? And I do think that there is increasing recognition. I'm going to point to the AZEL program at the National Science Foundation again, because it's the program with which I have the most experience, right? They require an evaluation of the activities that you have proposed to do. And I don't think that they are unique in that, although please feel free to correct me there. Maybe they are.
Are those evaluations publicly and widely available?
They are, yeah, sorry. I think they are publicly available. So I'm thinking about, for example, a project that Ashley Landrum did with, I'm forgetting, but on girls in science, right? And encouraging more girls to be involved in science. And that evaluation report is available online. Now, this is a different question, how we come to find those reports. It's the same question as how we come to find information in media, right? I don't know who is looking, right? But you sort of have to know that they exist in order to look, right? So that's a different question.
I note my personal experience that the quality and even existence of evaluation varies as much as the quality and existence of the broader impact project itself. I've been pleasantly surprised that for some of the larger NSF funded projects that I've been involved with when we're looking at MRSECs or science and technology centers, like that large scale project, that there has been a fairly rigorous, request for evaluation and dissemination of that data. But for the average PI who's doing a broader impact, who comes through our science communication training, I would say it's rare that I ever hear from them again about evaluation of whatever project they chose to do.
All right, we're running down the clock on our session. I'll give everybody a chance to have one last final hurrah comment. And let's start with Matt this time.
Yeah, thanks again. I'll just use my final comment to thank you for allowing the space for these conversations. Like Sara mentioned, a lot of times when we get into doing this work and doing this research, a lot of times it's hard. You try to make your stuff fit on whatever context you tend to be working on. But one anecdote I thought of earlier, but I neglected to share, is one time I was working with some hydrological engineers, and they I said, I want to figure out how people create decision, how we can design information better around decision-making and drought. And they said, well, what kind of drought? And I said, what? I don't know, and I don't necessarily care. And so I think that illustrates the example of, thank you again for bringing the researchers, the practitioners, the scholars together to have these conversations. I think even some of the lexicon that we use, we think is the same, but it's not. And so I really look forward to seeing how the field advances from initiatives like this. It's really, really exciting to be part of.
Jayatri, 15 seconds.
I think what's exciting about basic science is just the diversity of science and scientists that are involved. And so that's really what gets me interested in pursuing this landscape, is how do we leverage the richness of the work and the people to increase that feeling of belonging and participation in the broader society.
Nick.
Yeah, mine is also going to be a gratitude. Thanks so much for creating a platform like this, and paradoxically complain about the gap between research and practice while gathering researchers and practitioners together. It's so rich to get to learn from everyone. I love being connected with everyone. It's been hard to be in the panel because the chat is so awesome. I can't wait to read it afterwards. And then I'm reminded of what was said in the panel before, of when the American Physical Society was talking about when they train scientists, they tell them to listen first. And I think that might also be some good advice for us as to how to set the research agenda. So thank you for being here. Thank you for letting us listen.
And Sara, take us out, please.
Yeah, I think with my closing comments, I want to address one of Keegan's questions in the chat, or in the Q&A, the role of qualitative research, right? I think in setting the research agenda, we should not have blinders on as to the methodology that we are using to answer the questions that we ask. I think there are appropriate methodologies for different questions, right? And I see an equal role for qualitative research as well as quantitative work. I am a quantitative researcher, but while I'm on sabbatical, I'm also trying to learn some qualitative research methods, as well as bolster and refresh some of the quantitative methods that I'm doing. And so I think, having diversity in many forms, right, methodological as well, is important for us and setting a research agenda as we move forward. In the last 30 seconds, I just want to say one thing that we haven't talked too much about is this distinction between basic and applied science. And I am still, I will say, not convinced that this distinction is necessarily important, right? I think about the framework. One thing it lacks, for example, is the distinction between basic and applied science, because I think those are sort of covered by those communication goals, right? Objectives, the tactics that you use to address those. And thank you for bringing us together.
Our pleasure. And thank you all for being such great panelists, and audience for being such great contributors to both to the questions and to the thoughts around here. Be sure to come back for the next session in a few minutes to see Keegan set the table for us, for helping hear from all of you about the work ahead of us. This is always one of the most exciting parts of a conference for me, and I'm looking forward to it, and I hope to see you all back there. Thanks again.